Hello and welcome to another Mr. Carter Science Special. In this video we're going to be looking at the syllabus specification B2 structure and function of living things, and in particular we're going to look at diet and nutrients. So in this first section we're going to look at the various different nutrients that we have to consume as food, and we're going to cover, as always, these areas of the specification down here. So the first thing that we have here is called an eat well plate, and an eat well plate shows us the idealized version of what we should be eating with every single meal. You'll notice a third of that meal should be fruit and vegetables, approximately a third should be potatoes, breads, rices or pasta, and then the remaining third is split between dairy, fat and sugar, and non-dairy sources of protein, things like meat and fish. Now the key thing to notice on here is that we must consume fat and sugar. There's a lot of things been said about all the negative aspects of fat and sugar and how they will affect adversely our health. However, if you look at this plate, we must have them. They are a key part of our diet. But the amount we need, the amount we should consume, is tiny in proportion to the amount of fruit and vegetables we need and potatoes, breads and pastas. Will be around about 8% of our diet should be fats and sugars. Most of us, myself included, are probably far higher than that. What we should be aiming for is we should be aiming to have a balanced diet. So what's the definition of a balanced diet? Well, a balanced diet means eating all the correct nutrients in the correct amounts. And that's the key to it. Correct nutrients in the correct amounts. Eat too much of one, it's not a balanced diet. Eat not enough of one, and it's not a balanced diet. So what are the nutrients? What nutrients should we be trying to consume? Well, there are 7 nutrients, depending on how you define them. Carbohydrates, proteins, fats, vitamins and minerals, water and fibre. Each one is a key part of your diet, and we must consume them all, as we've just said, in the correct amounts. So what is the function of each of these nutrients in our diets, and what foods can we find them in? Well, I've got that listed in the next few slides, and the important thing to notice is that in green we have the foods that each nutrient is found in, and in blue we have the best phrasing for your exams and the perfect definition of why we need each particular nutrient. So for example, proteins are found in red meat and chicken, fish, nuts and beans. If you are vegetarian, will contain a large amount of a protein. But why do we need it? Well, we need protein for growth and repair. Any damage to your cells that need repairing, we need proteins in order to create the new tissues. If you are young and growing and getting taller, you need to create new cells, and for doing that we need proteins. The next one on the list is fats. Fats are found in fried food, oils, fast food, chips, burgers, etc. We often consume far too many fats. So why do we need them in the body? Well, fat is an energy store. Anytime that your body thinks that perhaps you won't be eating in the next few days, weeks, then it will store any extra fat you have to see you through the lean months when you might not have as much food available. In our modern society, that's a very rare thing, which leads us to a large amount of health issues, in particular fat leading to things like an increased risk of heart attacks. The other thing to notice is that fats are an insulator. And it's a physics word for you. An insulator is anything which stops or slows the movement of heat. So the more fat you have in your body, the less heat you lose. So somebody living in the far north of the world, in the Arctic Circle for example, will require a large amount of fat as an insulator, and there's certainly a lot more fat than compared to somebody living in and around the equator where it's a lot warmer. The next nutrients are our carbohydrates. Now, carbohydrates are chemicals that are made out of just 3 elements. They're made out of carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. And we can see that in the way that the word is actually phrased. Carbo for carbon, hydra meaning hydrogen, and then this final word here, ate. Anytime you see the ending of a chemical name ate, it means it's a compound, so it's made out of more than one chemical element chemically joined together, and one of those elements that is chemically joined together is the element oxygen. Carbohydrate, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. So we've got two versions of carbohydrates in our diet. First ones are starches. These are very, very long molecules made out of only carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. And we have sugars, much smaller molecules, again made out of carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. So why do we need these? Well, these carbohydrates are an energy source. We need them to provide energy in our body, and they're mainly used in the form of glucose in respiration, whereby the glucose is joined with some oxygen and energy is released in the form of ATP. We also need fibre in our diet, and fibre is found in fruits and vegetables. Largely fibre is actually made out of a chemical called cellulose. It's the cell walls of the fruits and vegetables, and we don't have an enzyme that can break down cellulose. So the cellulose will pass into our mouths and out through the anus without being digested at all. But it's still an incredibly important nutrient that we need. Firstly, it helps food move through your digestive system by a process called peristalsis. Now, peristalsis is when your muscles of your small intestine will contract in a wave of muscular contraction, one to the next, slowly pushing the food all the way down your small intestine. But if there's no fibre, there's almost nothing to push against, so your food tends not to move. As my nana used to say, we need the fibre to keep you regular. It will help you poo. The science word or the biological word for poo is egestion, the removal of undigested waste. It's also very important in the fact that fibre seems to have a role in preventing cancers of the large intestine. The final mineral or nutrient on our body is water. Technically not a nutrient, but we need it in order to keep you hydrated, to keep all your cells full of water, so all the different nutrients and chemicals and elements that you have within your body, within your cells, can all be dissolved in water. So if we have a look at these nutrients in a bit more detail, we can see what their molecules are made out of. Protein, for example, over here, proteins are made out of a long line of amino acids joined together. There's 23 different amino acids, but they all share the basic same structure. They only differ in a section called the R group, when there's 23 different R groups. In order to make an amino acid, you need to have some nitrogen in there, but the rest of the amino acid is just a carbohydrate. So if we have, as I've represented here, with different shapes, different amino acids all bonded together, all joined together to make a long line, that long line of amino acids is called a protein. We also have fats, and a fat molecule is actually made up of two different types of molecule. It's made out of some glycerol joined to 1, 2, 3 fatty acid molecules held together by these bonds here. Our bonds there. So those bonds will hold together with two different types of molecule to make a fat molecule. For carbohydrates, as we said earlier, there are two different carbohydrates, starches and sugars, all made out of carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. And if we look at the sugar, a sugar is a relatively small molecule. The most important molecule, the most important sugar that we will study and keep coming back to is glucose. And glucose has a hexagon structure. So if we take one hexagon, one glucose molecule, and then we join them all together in a long line, often thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of glucose long, then we will get a starch molecule. And these starch molecules are made as a storage molecule in plants, which is why we will often get our starches from plants. For example, bread that's made from wheat or rice, which again store these starches. For our own bodies, we cannot store starch. So when we need to store our sugars in the liver, we will store those sugars as a long molecule called glycogen. And again, it's a very similar molecule to starch in that it's a very long chain molecule made out of many, many glucose all joined together. So in animal cells, the carbohydrates are stored as glycogen. Other nutrients that we need to look at, we need to consider the vitamins and the minerals. So there's two main vitamins that we need to look at. Vitamin C, which is found in citrus fruits like oranges and lemons and limes and strawberries. And the main reason we need this in the body is it prevents a disease called scurvy. Now, scurvy was a very common disease around 200 years, 300 years ago. In fact, almost as soon as sailors began to be able to navigate well enough to move away from land and stay at sea for months at a time. But without electricity, without fridges, they couldn't keep fruit and vegetables fresh. So they would eat a lot of biscuits. And that meant they had a lack of vitamin C in their diet. And one of the main reasons we need vitamin C is it holds together connective tissue. So this connective tissue is tissues that can hold together things like holding your gums in place, holding the skin onto bone, onto muscle. So if you have scurvy, things like your gums begin to bleed an awful lot. The tissue, the connective tissue that's holding in your blood vessels and keeping the blood inside your blood vessels begins to break down. So your gums begin to bleed and eventually your teeth will fall out. Your skin becomes very pale, your eyes become sunken, and you might be referred to as a pirate as a nickname, a scurvy dog. But really, you have a deficiency disease called scurvy. Vitamin D. Vitamin D is a nutrient we actually tend not to eat. It's a nutrient that we get through having a large amount of UV rays and sunlight hitting your skin. When your skin absorbs this sunlight, it can manufacture vitamin D. Now, we need vitamin D to prevent a disease called rickets. Now, if we don't have enough vitamin D in your body, you can't absorb calcium from your diet. So even if you're drinking a large amount of milk, because if you notice over here, milk contains calcium, your body cannot physically absorb it from the small intestine and absorb it into the cells. You need vitamin D to help you with that process. So if you don't have as much calcium in your body, your bones are not as strong. So we can see on this diagram here that the leg bones here have actually, instead of being straight, are beginning to bend and curve around. They should be straight, but they are curving. And obviously curved bones are not as strong. You don't walk in the correct position. And this is a disease called rickets. So again, we have a deficiency disease called rickets here, which is caused by a lack of vitamin D. Then we need to look at some minerals. We've already mentioned calcium, which is found in dairy and milk products, and we need calcium to produce the strong bones and healthy teeth. In fact, the hardest substance in your body is called enamel, and that's the outside of your teeth, and in order to produce that, we need calcium. So obviously having a large amount of calcium is very, very important as you are growing as a child, because your bones are getting longer. So a child would need more calcium than an adult. The other mineral we need to look at is iron. And iron is found in red meat and liver, and we need iron to make a particular protein called hemoglobin. At the very center of hemoglobin is one single iron atom. And hemoglobin is found in red blood cells. It's used to transport and bind to oxygen. So without enough hemoglobin, you'll have a disease called anemia, where you can't make enough red blood cells, you can't carry enough oxygen, so you can't do enough respiration in your cells, so you're not producing enough energy. One of the main symptoms of anemia is that you feel tired all the time because you can't carry out enough respiration. So iron is very, very important for producing hemoglobin and red blood cells. But there's a common exam question that's often asked: who needs more iron, a teenage boy or a teenage girl? Well, if we think about it, many people will go for the wrong answer and go a teenage boy. But actually, due to a teenage girl's period and menstruation, they lose a reasonable amount of blood every single month that needs to be replaced. So they need to replace the hemoglobin, and therefore they need iron in the diet in order to make that hemoglobin. There is a small distinction we need to mention between vitamins and minerals over here, and that's that vitamins are relatively large molecules. They're similar size to a sugar molecule, but minerals are much smaller. They're very soluble. They do not actually need to be digested, so if you've got them in your diet, they will merely move into the blood straight away through the small intestine by diffusion and active transport alone. We don't need to break them down. So here's 3 extra vitamins: vitamin A, vitamin B and vitamin K. I'm going to leave you to this now. I would recommend that you pause this video, and I would recommend you go away and do some research, 10 minutes. You try and find out what's the function of vitamin A, B and K in your diet. One of the key recommendations I have whenever you're watching any of these videos is that you pause the video often, and that you stop and you write notes and you be active with your learning. And I would recommend at this point that you pause the video and you go back and look at those few slides, spend 10-15 minutes, write down the information, then go and be active with it. Go and talk to somebody about what you've learnt. One of the ways that I try and help you out with your learning is by producing a number of questions here. So we've got 8 questions. Once you produce some notes, try these questions and see what you've learnt. Don't skip ahead. I'll give you the answers on the next slide. Pause the work now and let's see what you have learnt. So here are the answers. Question 1, define the term a balanced diet. Well, a balanced diet is all about eating the correct nutrients in the correct amounts. And if you remember, we had the Eat Well plate, which will help you understand the correct amounts you need to have. Name the 7 nutrients. I'm not going to list them down for you, but they are proteins, fats, carbohydrates, vitamins, minerals, water, and fibre. Name a food containing a protein. Well, we could have red meat, or perhaps if you're vegetarian, we could have nuts and beans. A food containing a carbohydrate, we could have something very healthy like rice or bread, or something unhealthy like a sugar donut or some crisps. Name a food containing fat. Well, again, we could go with crisps, we could go with burgers, we could go with almost any fried food. They all contain some fat. A food containing vitamin C. We could have oranges or limes or strawberries, lemons, any citrus fruit really. For each nutrient, explain why it's needed by the body. Well, unusually, I'm not going to give you the answers for this. If you've made your notes on the previous 7 slides, you should be able to mention and name all of these. Proteins are needed for growth and repair, fat's an insulator, fat is also an energy store, carbohydrates are a source of energy, and you must be very careful there. Carbohydrates are an instant source of energy. They're used in respiration. Fats are not used in respiration as readily, therefore they're an energy store. You can go and look at the other minerals. Particularly, you need to know vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin D, and you need to know about iron and calcium. Who needs more calcium in the diet? A teenager or an adult? Explain why. Well, the answer to that is for teenager, and when we explain, we try and use a definition. So calcium is needed for strong bones and healthy teeth, and in a teenager they are growing, their bones are getting longer, so they need more calcium. The adult, on the other hand, needs less calcium because their bones have stopped growing. We do need calcium, we still need to maintain those bones, but they are no longer getting longer. Who needs more iron in their diet, a teenage boy or a teenage girl? As I explained on the previous slide, that's a teenage girl because she's losing blood in the menstruation over period, and that needs to be replaced. Iron is needed to make hemoglobin, write that down, which is found in red blood cells. Which vitamin helps form connective tissue in the gums? That is vitamin C. And which vitamin helps to form cells in the retina? Well, if you did the extension exercise and you did some research, you will know that that is vitamin A. So once we understand about the nutrients, we need to be able to test food to find out which particular nutrients are in which particular types of food. Hopefully in your lessons at school, you've done something similar to these tests. And ultimately it comes down to just remembering 4 sentences and then being able to apply those sentences and the chemicals and the colour changes to various different scenarios that the exam will give you. So the first test is the test for starch. And this one's a relatively simple test. We're going to take some iodine and we're going to put a drop of iodine on the food. If we get a blue-black colour, that means we have starch. So what's the sentence? We can test foods to find out what chemicals they contain. Yellow iodine turns blue-black when starch is present. You need to write that down and you need to memorize that sentence. Yellow iodine turns blue-black when starch is present. The next test is a test for glucose. Now remember, it's still a carbohydrate, just like starch, but it's a bit more difficult to test for it. So in this case, we need to take a chemical called blue Benedict's. Blue Benedict's. And we need to warm the solution. So take your food, add it to a test tube with some blue Benedict's and warm that solution. It's a key part and often an extra mark in your exams. And what's the sentence? Blue Benedict's solution turns orange-red when glucose is present. Only we can actually improve that because this orange-red is not the preferred term. We actually prefer to use this term, brick red. So blue Benedict's solution turns brick red when glucose is present. And if you look at a house in the UK, a lot of them are made out of bricks. I've got a photo of one here, and it's that particular red colour that we're looking for. If you get that brick red colour, then glucose is present. One of the things you may have noticed if you've done this experiment in school is actually we sometimes have foods which only have a small amount of glucose in. So you will often get the blue Benedict's turning first green and then into the red colour when we have a large amount of glucose present. How do we test for proteins? Well, first of all, what's our sentence? We need to add a chemical called biuret A and B. That's 2 chemicals, and they will turn purple when protein is present. One of the ways we can remember that is a P and a P. Purple when protein is present. So firstly, you add biuret A, and biuret A is potassium hydroxide. And then you shake it and then add copper sulfate, which is biuret B. And if we get that purple colour, that means that proteins are present. What about the test for fat then? So what we have to do there is we've got 2 stages. First of all, we need to grind up our food with some ethanol present. Fats will dissolve in ethanol. They will not dissolve in water. They're insoluble in water. So first of all, grind the food with ethanol. Then you might have to filter the solution first before adding water. So grind the food, filter it, and add some water. Ethanol and water will turn cloudy when fats are present. So that's 4 sentences you need to write down, you need to memorize, and then you need to be able to apply those color changes to explain whether you think that a food contains a starch, a sugar, fat or protein. I've even seen one particular question where they merely asked, was carbohydrate present? In which case you needed to understand carbohydrates would be sugars or starches, and you needed to know both tests for those 2. This is the results from the last time I did this lesson, and you can see that my students carried out each test and they were able to identify things like cheeses do not have any starch in them, but cheese has a large amount of fat and protein. They looked at strawberries, for example, and found that strawberries had no starch, but they had a large amount of sugar. Meat obviously contained fats and proteins. So not a comprehensive list, but it was a very well run experiment from my students. Hopefully you have done something similar in your classrooms. Look back through your notes, try and remind yourself of a practical application and the skills you learned, and hopefully the safety you learned by carrying out these food tests. I assume that you used a water bath to be safe in terms of the hot water with the glucose or the sugar test, and you were wearing goggles at all times to protect your eyes from all of those chemicals, particularly iodine, which can stain very badly. So again, here's some review questions. Please pause the video now, look back over the previous slides, make some notes, and then answer these questions. Find out what have you learned. I'll give you the answers in a moment. So let's look at some of the answers. Name the elements found in carbohydrates. Well, carbohydrates are made out of carbon, hydrogen, and the 8 stands for oxygen. Name the two groups of carbohydrates found in food. Well, we've got the starches and sugars. Explain how to safely test a piece of food in the presence of starch. Well, let's pick up a mark quickly. Anytime you hear safety, you need to mention wear goggles in the lab. What test are we looking for? Well, we're looking at yellow iodine, and that will turn a blue-black colour if starch is present. Explain how to safely test a piece of food for the presence of glucose. Well, there we need blue Benedicts, I think I've spelled that correctly, blue Benedicts, and that will turn brick red if glucose is present. How do we test for the presence of protein? Again, safely, don't forget the goggles. We need to have two chemicals which eventually have a blue colour, which are biuret A and B, and they will turn purple if protein is present. Purple for protein. And explain how to safely test a piece of food for the presence of fat. We need to firstly grind food with ethanol, filter and add water, and we're looking for a cloudy colour, and a cloudy colour means fats are present. You may have been asked to do this particular practical as well. You may have been asked to try and calculate the amount of energy in food. So you could use a piece of equipment known as a bomb calorimeter. So a bomb calorimeter is a very accurate piece of equipment. There is no energy loss at all when you're using a bomb calorimeter. We have clear insulating materials around the outside. All the energy that is being released from the food and measured by the equipment is contained within. More likely though, you will have used this kind of equipment where you're burning your piece of food here and you're using that energy to heat some water, and you're measuring with a thermometer the energy changes that occur as you're heating that. But don't forget, they might ask you in an exam about the efficiency of this or the reliability of the numbers that you've gathered, and you need to think about things like convection and radiation. You will have lost some heat to the left and the right by radiation, and you would have probably lost some heat going up and then down by convection. So they might ask you, how could you improve your method? Well, one of the ways you could possibly improve your method would be to take some foil or some metal sheets and place them left and right to prevent the radiation. Any radiation energy would be reflected back at the water, and you might also try and prevent a bit of heat loss from the top by convection. So what's the actual method? Well, here's the method for you. First of all, you would set up the apparatus as we've described, and you would need to know the following pieces of information. You would need to know how much water have you added in particular the volume and the mass of that water. You'd need to, before you start, measure the mass of your food, and you'd need to know the start temperature before you carry out the investigation. You'd then need to also know the end temperature after you've burnt your food and heated that water and the food can no longer burn again. Then you need to calculate the difference between these two to find out what was your temperature rise. Once you have those pieces of information, you can then use the formula below, where the energy calculated in joules per gram of your food is the mass of your water times the temperature rise times the specific heat capacity of water, which is 4.2. And then divide that by the mass of your bread so you can work out the figures per gram. What units will be used to measure energy in? Well, of course, energy is always measured in J or joules. And how can we improve the reliability of our results? As we've already discussed, you would be looking at trying to prevent heat loss. So that's the end of this video on diet and nutrition. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe and add your comments below.